Shalom, welcome back. And so we're continuing our delving into the study by Immanuel Velikovsky, Ages and Chaos, where he speaks about an alternate view of the timeline of history. He believes that the Egyptian chronology is placed 600 years too far back in the past, and so he's making a case for being able to prove that the Exodus, which occurred around the year 1500, I think it's probably around 1492, something like that, BC, that it was actually at the very end of the Middle Kingdom, and immediately after that, the Exodus coincided with the beginning of the Hyksos rule over Egypt. So basically, what we know about the Hyksos is that there was a collapse in the Egyptian kingdom. The Hyksos then came in and ruled Egypt for several hundred years before they were finally expelled. And once they were expelled, then the new kingdom came into place. So the Hyksos rule is a bit of a dark age for Egyptian history. So we've reached a point in our study where we're about to see the first appearance of the Hyksos. And then we're going to get more into actually identifying who they are as we progress. Many people think that the Hyksos may be the Hebrews because you see Joseph coming in and kind of ruling over Egypt, and so people think that the Hyksos were the Hebrews because they think that maybe the Hyksos were led by Joseph. But if you look at the actual behavior and traits of the Hyksos, it doesn't really fit what we would think of as Israelites. They were a very cruel people. They were very violent. They oppressed the people of Egypt severely. And we're not talking about in the book of Genesis where Joseph more or less sets Pharaoh up to buy the people's property in order to keep them from starving to death. We're not talking about that kind of repression. We're talking about cutting off arms and legs of people who disobeyed, plucking out the eyes of dissenters, that kind of very violent oppression. It's not really something you would expect from the Hebrew people. Again, I mentioned that this is the framework for this teaching is from Immanuel Velikovsky, Ages and Chaos, and I'm pretty much taking it word for word. So I guess you couldn't even say the framework of the teaching, but the teaching itself is from Velikovsky. I'll put a link in the description if you want to download a copy of this book, and that same link is in each video that I'm posting. So picking up from part 2, at the end of part 2, Israel just exited the land, and so there was no longer any royal power in Egypt. In the following weeks, the cities turned to scenes of looting. Justice ceased to function. The mob dug in the debris and into the public records where contracts, notes, and pledges and deeds to real property were filed. The plunderers searched among the wreckage of the royal storehouses. And so we see this in the papyrus. This is the papyrus of Apur. We read parts of it in the last couple of presentations. It says, "Forsooth the laws of the judgment hall are cast forth. Men walk upon them in the public places." So men are walking upon the public documents, the judgments. "The storehouses of the king is the common property of everyone." So you get this picture of lawlessness and anarchy. The papyrus furnishes information as to what happened afterwards. The earth's crust repeatedly contracted in violent spasms, years of noise. The roads become impassable or dragged and flooded. The realm was depopulated, and Apur bewails the lack of people. The residence of the Pharaoh was a heap of ruins. Governmental authority was completely shattered. Behold, the chiefs of the land flee. Behold, no offices are in their right place. Like a frightened herd without a herdsman, the poor man who ran away roamed the desert. Slaves who remain in Egypt raised their heads. So notice you have the poor. You could even say the Ebionite or the Ebionites or the the slaves that ran off into the desert and escaped. Papyrus 6:7 says, "Forsooth, the public offices are open, and their census lists are taken away." So the invaders approached out of the gloom of the desert. They crossed the borders and entered the shattered land. Papyrus 3:1, "Forsooth, the desert is throughout the land. The nomes are laid waste. A foreign tribe from abroad has entered or has come to Egypt." The catastrophe that rendered Egypt defenseless was a signal to the tribes of the Arabian desert. What has happened? Through it is to cause the Asiatics to know the condition of the land. They have come to an end for themselves. There are none found to stand and protect themselves. So you see this group of Asiatics. Now these we believe to be the Hyksos that are coming in to invade the land. Prostrated by the appalling blows of nature, the Egyptians did not defend themselves. It is not clear whether 1 million of people in the next sentence is the number of the perished or of the intruders. Today fear, more than 1 million of people, not seen, enemies, enter into the temples, weep. To all the previous plagues, this was added. Pillagers completed the destruction, killing and raping. So you even have another plague coming on. The final plague that was even after the death of the firstborn were these invaders, these Hyksos that were coming into Egypt. The double catastrophe caused by nature and by the invasion destroyed all class distinction and brought about a social revolution. Behold, noble ladies go hungry. Behold, he who slept without a wife through want finds precious things. He who passed the night in squalor raises his head. She who looked at her face in the water is possessor of a mirror. It was anarchy. Nobody worked. Behold, no craftsman work, is what the papyrus says. A man strikes his brother, the son of his mother. Men sit behind the bushes until the benign traveler comes, in order to plunder his burden. Behold, one uses violence against another. If 3 men journey upon a road, they are found to be 2 men. The greater number slay the less. The land is a weed that destroys men. So you're getting a picture here from these words of Apur that the land was completely decimated and it was chaos. How terrible it is. What am I to do? Laments Apur. Woe is me because of the misery in this time. Several expressions of Apur indicate that the text of the papyrus was composed shortly after a major catastrophe. The aftermath and subsequent disturbances of nature were not yet at their end. Many parts of the papyrus are missing. The beginning and the end, doubtless containing details, possibly names, are destroyed. But what is preserved is sufficient to impress us with this fact. Before us is not merely the story of a catastrophe, but an Egyptian version of the plagues. It was surprising to find in the papyrus, in addition to the story of dwellers in marshes and poor men who fled the land scourged by plagues, laments about the invaders who came from the desert of Asia, preyed on the disorganized country, and became its violent oppressors. Amu, or the Hyksos, were the invaders who ruled Egypt during the centuries that separate the period of the Middle Kingdom from the New Kingdom. So Amu, or Hyksos. Now, Amu is the term that the Egyptians refer to them as. Hyksos is the term that's used by Greek historians that write about them. I believe both words mean foreigners or foreign people. In the 1860s, in El Arish, a town on the border between Egypt and Palestine, the attention of a traveler was attracted to a shrine of black granite inscribed with hieroglyphics over all its surfaces. It was used by the Arabs of the locality as a cattle trough. An account of this shrine and a partial translation of the text were published in 1890. The shrine was still being used as a trough. Sometime during the 20th century, the stone was brought into the Museum of Ismailia, and a new attempt to translate the text was undertaken. Since its discovery, the monolith of El Arish has been mentioned only infrequently, and its strange text has been regarded as rather mythological. Though kings, residences, and geographical places are named and an invasion of foreigners is described, the names of deities appearing in the text are local cognomens. The inscription is of Ptolemaic or Hellenistic age, but die events related are of a much earlier period, that of King Thorn and his successor. In this inscription, the name of King Thorn is written in a royal cartouche, a fact that points to the historical background of the text. So even though the stone appears to be of a late origin, the text itself seems to be a something that is historical, that dates back to an earlier time. In the mutilated text, there are these lines. The land was in great affliction. Evil fell on this earth. It was a great upheaval in the residence. Nobody left the palace during 9 days, and during these 9 days of upheaval, there was such a tempest that neither the men nor the gods could see the faces of the next. So it was speaking about darkness. Similar mention of a darkness that had lasted for a number of days that confined everyone to his place, that was accompanied by a great upheaval, and that it was so complete that no one could discern the face of his neighbor, is found in the book of Exodus, in the story of the 9th plague. And there was a thick darkness in all the land of Egypt 3 days. They saw not one another, neither rose any from his place for 3 days. The Egyptian text differs from the Hebrew in that it numbers the 9 days of darkness. A strong wind is mentioned in the scriptures in connection with the removal of the preceding plague of the locusts. They were brought by the east wind and covered the face of the whole earth, so that the land was darkened. And they were removed by a mighty, swift west wind. Exodus 10:19. And Yeshua turned a mighty, strong west wind, which took away the locust, and cast them into the Red Sea. Immediately thereafter came the 9th plague, the thick darkness. In the story of darkness in Egypt, as told in old Midrash books, additional details are given. The plague of darkness endured 7 days. During the first 3 days, one could still change his position. During the next 3 days, one could not stir from his place. The rabbinical sources so describing the calamity of darkness are numerous. Josephus Flavius and Philo the Alexandrian of the 1st century of the present era also belong to what may be called rabbinical sources. The collation of this material presents the following picture. Exceeding strong west wind, endured 7 days. All the time of the land was enveloped in darkness. The darkness was of such a nature that it could not be dispelled by artificial means. The light of the fire was either extinguished by the violence of the storm, or else it was made invisible and swallowed up in the density of the darkness. None was able to speak or hear, nor could anyone venture to take food, but they lay themselves down, their outward senses in a trance. Thus they remained, overwhelmed by the affliction. The last, the 7th day of darkness, overtook the land when the Israelites were at the Sea of Passage. In the book of Exodus 14:20, it is said that it was a cloud and a darkness, so that the camp of the Egyptians came not near the camp of the Israelites at night. And Yahuwah caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night. So notice it's not, this is actually something I've never noticed, that it was a cloud and the darkness that stood between the Egyptians and the Israelites. So it's almost like it was a darkness that has substance to it, or is a darkness that could be felt. Tradition puts the time from the 10th plague, which followed immediately the plague of darkness, until the passage of the sea at 6 days and a few hours. The exodus that followed the night of the 10th plague is commemorated on the 1st day of Passover, and the passage of the sea on the last, the 7th day of Passover. So Mr. Velikovsky is he's actually Jewish, like he's a Jewish man, so he was familiar with many of the Jewish traditions and the Midrash, and he also pulls heavily from the Ginsburg's Legends of the Jews. So I'm not giving you citations for all these references that Velikovsky is making. Most of them, if not all of them, are in the PDF that is linked in the description. So if you're wanting the citations, if you want to know where all this information is coming from that Mr. Velikovsky is putting forth, get the PDF. Mr. Velikovsky's books are all heavily footnoted, And so there's plenty of information for you to follow up in the original sources. The Hebrew version of the plague of darkness is not unlike the Egyptian version. It was not the darkness of a quiet night. It was a violent storm that rushed in fine ashes. The darkness came from the hell and could be felt. In the tempest and darkness that lasted for days and nights, it was difficult to measure time. Men, overwhelmed by misfortune, were bereft of the exact judgment of the passage of time. Under such circumstances, the slight discrepancy between the text on the stone, 9 days of darkness, and the tradition of the Midrashim, 7 days of darkness, is negligible. So in other words, if you can imagine hiding out in your house for a week when you couldn't see the hand in front of your face, would you have any way of knowing whether you were there for 9 days or 7 days? So Mr. Velikovsky saying, if you really think about the conditions, you might be able to understand why the people did not know, or there was a discrepancy. The Hebrew sources tell that cities were devastated in the darkness, and that many Israelites were among the dead from the 9th plague. The land fell into distress and ruin. Evil fell upon this earth. The earth is in great affliction, a great disturbance in the residence, and passages on the shrine describing the 9 days of darkness and tempest when nobody could see anything and none could leave the palace. In the midst of the savageries of nature, His Majesty of Shaul assembled his host and ordered them to follow him to regions where he promised they would again see light. We shall see our father Ra Hakari in the luminous region of Bakrit. So basically, this is coming from the altar or the shrine that was being used as a feeding trough. It mentioned this person, the Majesty of Shaul, who took the people in search of daybreak because the darkness was so great. Under cover of darkness, intruders from the desert approached the border of Egypt. His Majesty Shaul went to battle against the companions of Apopi. Apopi was the fierce god of darkness. The king and his host never returned. They perished. Now when the Majesty of Harm Ahis, I guess that's how you say it, or Harakiti, fought with evildoers in this pool, the place of the whirlpool, the evildoers prevailed not over His Majesty. His Majesty leapt into the so-called place of the whirlpool. So compare this to Exodus. The sea returned its strength, and the Egyptians fled against it. And Yahuwah overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea, and the waters returned, and covered the chariots, and the horsemen, and all the host of Pharaoh that came into the sea after him. And Pharaoh himself perished too, for the horse of Pharaoh went in with his chariots and with his horsemen into the sea, and Yahuwah brought again the waters of the sea upon them. So you see that this is seems to be lining up with what we're reading on that shrine. It says the story of darkness in Egypt, as told in Hebrew and Egyptian sources, is very similar. The death of the Pharaoh and the whirling waters is also similar in both Hebrew and Egyptian sources, and the values of this similarity is enhanced by the fact that both versions, the Pharaoh perished in a whirlpool during or after the days of the great darkness and violent hurricane. And yet, even a striking similarity is not identity. The subject of the two records should be regarded as identical only if some detail can be found in both versions, the Hebrew and the Egyptian, that cannot be attributed to chance. So if you're wondering where Velikovsky is getting all this information about the whirlpool and the hurricane, or the hurricane itself, I mentioned it before, his book, Ages in Earth and Upheaval, goes into detail about it, and Worlds in Collision. His book, Worlds in Collision, goes into much more detail about the Exodus itself. The Exodus is only covered in one chapter of Ages in Chaos, the book that we're studying now. The march of the Pharaoh with his host is related amidst the description of the great upheaval in the residence and the tempest that made the land dark. He arrived at a place designated by name, His Majesty, finds on this place called Pi Kahoroti. A few lines later, it is said that he was thrown by a great force. He was thrown by the whirlpool high into the air. He departed to heaven. He was no longer alive. The explanation of the translator of the text concerning this geographical designation, Pi Kararoti, is not known except in this example. So the translator is saying that this Pi Karaoti is a place that there's no other record of. Here, attempted identification of the subject of the two versions, the Hebrew and the Egyptian, is not incorrect if the locality where the Pharaoh perished was a place by the Sea of Passage. Exodus 14:9. But the Egyptians pursued after them all the horses and the chariots of Pharaoh, and overtook them encamping by the sea beside Pi-har-Hiroth, or Kiroth. Pi-Ha'aroti is Pi-Kiroth of the Hebrew text. It is the same place. It is the same pursuit. It is erroneous to say that the name is met nowhere else except on the shrine. So Velikovsky is basically, calling the translator out, saying, how can you say that this place there's no record of it? The inscription on the shrine relates to that after a time, a son of the Pharaoh, his majesty Geb, set out himself. He asked the information. The eyewitnesses from the neighboring abodes give him the information about all that happened to Ra in Yat-Nabes, the combats of King Thon. Okay, so essentially this guy, Geb, was the son of the Pharaoh, the prince, if you would. And so he set off to look after what happened to his father, whom the text calls Ra, because all the pharaohs believed that they were the reincarnation of Ra, the sun god. So he goes off looking for his father, and he's asking people for information. It says here in the second paragraph, all who accompanied the prince were killed by a terrible blast, and the prince, His Majesty Geb, sustained burns before he returned from his expedition to seek his father, who had perished. Now, in Worlds in Collision, one of the things that Velikovsky brings forth is that there was records of thunderbolts, a discharge between a comet that passed near Earth that he believes may have been the cause of the plagues of the Exodus. It says, invaders approaching by way of Yat-Nabes came in the gloom and overpowered Egypt. The children of Apopi, the rebels that are at Osheru, are not identified. So he's not really sure what this Osheru is, I guess. But it says, and in the desert they approached by way of Yat-Nabes and fell upon Egypt at the fall of darkness. They conquered only to destroy. These rebels, they came from the mountains of the Orient by all the ways of Yat-Nabes. The prince retreated before the invaders. He did not return to Heliopolis. He did not go on with or like the companions of the thieves of the scepter. He was robbed of his heritage. He secluded himself in the provincial residence of Hai Taui in the land of the plants, Hinno. Therefore, he made an attempt, entirely unsuccessful, to communicate with the foreigners and the Amu, that they leave his country. In his helplessness, he recalled how his father, who succumbed in the whirlpool in better days, had battled all the rebels and massacred the children of Apopi. So the children of Apopi would be the leader of this new group that's coming in, and apparently it was a group that Egypt had fought with in the past. But now that Egypt was crippled, here comes these invaders in to take over the land. It is not known what happened to the unhappy prince. His end was certainly sad. Egypt was devastated by the tempest and scorched by fire. The residence was seized by the Amu. The inscription on the shrine at El Arish says that the name of the pharaoh who perished in the whirlpool was Thorn or Thone. It is of interest that Thorn means the abode of thorn. Pithom was one of the two cities built by the Israelite slaves for the Pharaoh of oppression. And Manetho, the Pharaoh in whose days the blast of heavenly displeasure fell upon Egypt, preceding the invasion of the Hyksos is called Tutmoenos or Titmaeos. A papyrus text preserved in the Hermitage in Leningrad and listed in the catalog of the museum as number 1116b recto is a literary echo of the fateful days when the empire of Egypt perished and the land fell prey to invading nomads. In this papyrus, the same story is related that we now know from the papyrus Ipuwer, but in a different way. The upheavals of nature and the subsequent subjugation of Egypt by the desert tribes are recounted, not as events in the past or present, but as things that are to come. Obviously, this indicates only a preference for the literary form of foretelling. So basically, in addition to the shrine and the scroll of Ipuwer, there's also this other papyrus that describes the similar events, but it's written in a way as if it is prophesying these future events, but it was probably written actually after the events occurred. It said, a sage by the name of Pharaoh asked his royal listener whether he would like to hear about the things past or things future. And His Majesty says, nay, of things future. The seer was brooding over what should come to pass in the land and conjuring up the condition of the East when the Asiatics, or the Amu, approached in their might and in their heart's rage. And he said, up, my heart, and bewail this land thou art sprung. The land is utterly perished, and nothing remains. Perished is this land. The sun is veiled and shines not on the side of men. None can live when the sun is veiled by clouds. The river is dry, even the river of Egypt. The south wind shall blow against the north wind. The earth has fallen into misery. Bedouins pervade the land, for foes are in the east, or the side of the sun rising. And Asiatics shall descend upon Egypt. The beasts of the desert shall drink from the rivers of Egypt. This land shall be in perturbation. I show thee the land upside down. Happened that which never yet had happened. Men laugh with the laughter of pain. None there is who weepeth because of death. None knoweth that midday is there. His son's shadow is not discerned, nor dazzled is the sight when he is beheld. He is in the sky like the moon. This is interesting to me when I read it, because I can remember a lot of mornings driving to work. The area that I lived in, there was one of the areas I had to drive through was a place that was very prone to fog, and so a lot of mornings I would drive through there on my way to work, and it would be so foggy that I would look up and I would see the sun shining through the fog, and I wouldn't be able to tell if it was the sun or a full moon because it looked like a full moon. And so here at the end of this slide, it says that the sun, he is in the sky like the moon, and that's what it reminds me of. Like this, if there was like a thick cloud of dust and debris or whatever, I think it would give that same appearance. From the description of the changes in nature, we can recognize them as belonging to the period when the Israelites roamed the desert, under a cloudy sky, in the land of shadow, the shadow of death. Jeremiah, centuries later, complained, neither said they, where is Yeshua that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, that led us through the wilderness, through a land of deserts and of pits, through a land of drought and in the shadow of death. In numerous other passages in the Scriptures, this shadow of death is mentioned during the years of wandering in the desert. The sky was veiled. Clouds hung over the desert. All life processes were impaired, and for this reason the gloom was called the shadow of death. The plague of darkness, which I maintain, the shadow of death, was a lasting reminder, is dealt with in the Worlds in Collision, which investigates the physical side of the catastrophe. So again, the same book that I mentioned, Worlds in Collision. If you want to know more about what he's talking about here, because he's not going into as much detail. But I highly recommend you read that book. I think you'll enjoy it if you're at all interested in biblical history. It says, after giving this picture of the natural disaster combined with the political subjugation of Egypt by the Amu, the seer Nephero, who prophesied the liberation by a king who would be born of a Nubian woman called Amini. The Amu shall fall by his sword. Thereafter there shall be built up the wall of the prince, so as not to allow the Amu to go down to Egypt. It is questionable whether Amini is a historical personality, because of some surmise as to his identity. The papyrus was supposed to have been written during the Old Kingdom, or shortly after its end. It is also apparent that this text has much in common with the text of the papyrus at Leiden. However, the Hyksos, or the Amu period in Egypt, followed the end of the Middle Kingdom. The name Ameni may refer to Amenhotep, one of the first kings of Egypt, after it was freed from the Hyksos. At the time of liberation, he was a prince. He is usually pictured as black, which would also confirm with the words born of a Nubian woman, and he was highly revered in later times. So again, he's making this connection to the end of the Hyksos period, the beginning of the New Kingdom, being the time of this Ameni that is prophesied here. A literary remnant that closely resembles the Hermitage papyrus recto is a prophecy of a potter under King Amenephis. The waterless Nile will be filled, the displaced winter will come in its own season, the sun will resume its course, and the winds will be restrained. For in the typhon time, the sun is veiled. This prophecy is preserved in a papyrus written in Greek, being a translation of an older Egyptian text. The Pharaoh's name points to one of the Amenhotep's of the New Kingdom, and I assume refers to the same Ameni or Amenhotep's. Okay, so then you have this other witness that he's bringing forth, speaking about this Amenhotep's that's going to rise up when things kind of go back to their normal function of things. Okay, so the question is, does Puer describe the plagues of the Exodus? I would say I think he does. So now we're going to get in our next video, we're going to look at who are the mysterious Asiatics who invaded immediately after the Israelites left. And so all of this is important to really laying a good case for whether Velikovsky is correct in his alternate timeline. Because if you have enough points of intersection with the biblical timeline, and then you can make a case that all of this is occurring at a concurrent time in the Scripture. So if the rise of the Hyksos occurred at the same time as the Exodus, then we should be able to match up future Egyptian events with future Israelite events, and if they coincide, then we can make a pretty solid case for Velikovsky being right. So anyway, I thank you for listening. I'm going to end this here, and we'll get back next time and pick it up with part 4. Thank you. Shalom.